Welcome, everyone. My name is Marisa Gomez. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. I'm really excited to spend Halloween week with you all. Tonight's program is part of a series called Museum of the Macabre that we have been doing all week long. We've explored taxidermy, we've explored caves, and tonight we are looking into mushrooms, which we love. Again, as I said to some of you who are already in the room, we'd love to chat with you throughout the program. And we're going to do that by having you use the chat function or the Q&A. For the chat, just go ahead and change who you're sending your message to from panelists to panelists and attendees so everyone can chat together. I just asked, what is the weirdest mushroom you've ever found? You can tell us a little bit about it if you want. Another question that seems thematically on point, if maybe you haven't found a lot of weird mushrooms, maybe you don't really think mushrooms are that weird, or maybe you think all mushrooms are weird, so it's like you can't choose. How about instead you can answer me this: what is something that others find scary but you love and don't find scary? So again, we're gonna have fun in the chat, get to chatting with us, but today I'm going to be handing it over to a dear friend of the museum, someone who has connected our community with nature in lots of different ways over the years as a program partner, and is back for tonight's program, Macabre Mushrooms, Ghouls of the Woods. And that is naturalist and co-author of the tome, Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, Christian Schwarz. So at this point, I'm going to welcome in Christian. Christian, are you there? Christian, are you there? I think Christian may have stepped away from the computer. There he is. Hi, Christian. You're muted. I muted you.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for being here. It looks like you are in somewhere maybe exciting, somewhere outside. Where are you, Christian?
I am near Lake Berryessa in the southern part of California's Intercoast Ranges, which is a place I hadn't really been before this week. It is a place that burned recently, Quail Ridge UC Reserve, and I'm leading a team of naturalists doing some post-fire monitoring on the UC Reserve. So that's where I am.
Cool. Yeah,
maybe we can landscape. Yeah, thematically.
Yeah.
Very spooky here.
Well, maybe we can chat about that a little bit more later on. But how about we start by getting into some macabre mushrooms? What do you say?
Sounds good. Should I share my screen now?
Take it away, yeah.
All righty. Oop, 1 second. Okay. All right. So I'm happy to be doing a Halloween talk for you. My name's Christian, by the way, Christian Schwarz. I live in Santa Cruz. I teach people about mushrooms, natural history. And today I'm going to be talking about spooky mushrooms, ghoulish mushrooms, mushrooms that might make you slightly uncomfortable. But maybe I'm going to propose, for reasons that don't make a lot of sense, maybe they shouldn't make you as uncomfortable as they do. And I think Marissa's question was a good one. What is something that you found that maybe you love that other people find creepy? And I sort of feel that all the time about mushrooms. A lot of people find fungi creepy for reasons that range from the fact that they are decomposers, or they're sort of an unusual and infrequently seen group of organisms for a lot of folks. They just seem sort of supernatural. They seem sort of strange, odd, macabre, perhaps. And some of them are more directly associated with death, dying, decay. And that has always weirded out our culture, I think. But perhaps that's what attracts them to me. I think they're slightly transgressive in that way. So I'm just going to get into it and start with the fact that when we talk about mushrooms, which are, if you're looking at this pie chart on the screen right now, there's sort of a little tiny slice of the pie over on the right in that pink chunk, and then a little bit of the red chunk over on the left. But there's a huge, huge variety of fungi in this kingdom, many of which we aren't familiar with because they're too small to see easily, or they have some weird ecology where we're not really in touch with the places they live. You have to go looking for them specifically in some very specialized way to detect them. And we'll talk about a few of these, some of which are actually really important from a human perspective. Just because we don't see them doesn't mean they don't have really big impacts on our lives. But fungi are a weird kingdom. They are in just about every habitat you can imagine, from the deep sea to every little shred of the terrestrial earth, as well as way up in the stratosphere, you can find fungal spores floating up there. They're everywhere. But they do all sorts of different things. They're not like plants where they're pretty much all doing one thing. You know, all plants are more or less primary producers, photosynthesizing sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water into sugar. Fungi are decomposers, they're mutualists, and they're parasites. So they have a big range of ecological roles that they play. So let's get into what some of these look like, especially those that are far-flung freaks in an already funky kingdom: the odd, the aberrant, and the disturbing. Because it's Halloween, right? Or, you know, pick your Samhain or Dia de los Muertos, whatever your death celebrating holiday is, we're getting close to it. So let's find some of these fungi. All right, this is a strange one that I haven't seen. My co-author, Noah Siegel, took this photo. Does anyone have a guess as to what that object is that all those little mushrooms are growing out of? If you have a guess, you can write it in the chat. I'll give you a few seconds. And maybe if someone gets it right, Marissa can interrupt me and tell me if someone got it right.
I think we have a possibly right answer. It looks like what I thought. So there's a couple of different guesses. I'll list off some of them. A brain, frog, dead possum, dead animal, and a dead rat.
Dead rat and dead animal are pretty close, because what that actually is that's an owl pellet, which means it's a compacted mass of bones and fur that an owl regurgitated because it couldn't digest them very well. And what that fungus is doing is it's digesting all the keratin, which is a protein, and it's saying, wait, the owl didn't want this? Well, I'll take it. And it's decomposing that keratin and breaking it back down into its constituent pieces and recycling those nutrients back into the environment. This fungus is called Onigina. I would love to see it. I've never seen it. It grows in Northern California, so it's certainly here. But if you find a decaying deer carcass or an owl pellet during the winter when it's really humid and damp, you could totally find this thing. It's probably not a great mushroom to handle because it does decay keratin, and you are largely made of keratin, your hair, your fingernails. So probably don't spend a lot of time handling it. But you know, it's owl pellets and decaying deer carcasses. You're probably not going to spend a lot of time handling it anyways.
Christian, could you just remind us what the name of this fungus is again?
Yeah, it's called Onigina, Onygena. And this one in particular is sort of unresolved which species it is. But I'm going to show you one in a second that we do know what it is. So there's another species in the genus Onigena that also grows on decaying keratin, and it can form some pretty dramatic fruitings when it grows on things like the horn tissue of an herbivore like a ram or a sheep. So all of those little powdery blobs on little stalks growing on this ram's horns are Onigena fungus. And these can look really spectacular. This one is from the UK. I don't think this one is too common here, but we do have it on like the hooves and bones of deer carcasses fairly frequently. It takes a little bit of luck to find these, and a little bit of willingness to go look in a micro habitat that not everyone is super excited to be around. But I think they're fascinating, and I would love to see them. So if you do find it, please let someone know. Upload it to iNaturalist or get in touch with me directly. So these are some spooky, ghoulish fungi. So ghoul, just as a point of etymology, is often referring to some sort of supernatural dark energy creature, dark spirited creature that feeds on the dead, or the souls of the dead. And so a lot of the fungi that I'm going to be talking about are parasites, or those things that mop up in direct ways on recently dead or decaying organisms. So entomopathogens, that's a big word that just means bug pathogens, insect pathogens. It's used sort of loosely to also refer to arachnid pathogens, things that are on other arthropods as well. But this represents a huge set of fungi, a large chunk of fungal diversity comes from entomopathogenic fungi. And they're represented even in widely divergent, not closely related groups of fungi. And one of the things they're most famous for is behavioral control, which is definitely spooky. These are our body controlling, mind controlling fungi. And I do mean that literally. One of the famous ones are the cordyceps fungi, where a spore will fall out of the canopy in a tropical rainforest, land on the body of an ant, and germinate into the body of the ant, take over its central nervous system, and actually control how that ant moves around the forest. And it will send chemical signals into the ant's nervous system and brain that make it sort of crawl upwards towards the light into the canopy, way up high, further into the canopy than it would ever naturally go. And then once it's way hundreds of feet above the forest floor, it'll clamp down its jaws and die and just sort of hang from a leaf. And what happens then is the really spooky part. The fungus consumes all the energy in the ant's body and grows sort of a sinuous sporulating stalk out of the top of the ant's head. And that's the entomopathogenic fruiting body, the cordyceps fruiting body that we see. And it'll rain down spores through the canopy onto all the ants at the forest floor. These are really amazing co-evolved systems of pathogens and their host species. And you can imagine just how many different insects there are in the world. You know, one of the most specious groups of animals anywhere is insects. Beetles, you know, there's that famous Darwin quote, God has an inordinate fondness for beetles because there's so many of them. And because it's such a tightly co-evolved relationship, it's sometimes the case that each individual species of arthropod will have an individual species of fungal pathogen that has evolved the specific chemistry to interact with its nervous system, which means that for every species of arthropod, you may have a corresponding species of fungal diversity, which means there's maybe millions of entomopathogens, maybe many more than that globally. So it's an amazingly diverse and really neat ecological group of organisms. The evolutionary stories here are really fascinating. But one in particular that I sort of recently got tuned into, and you may have seen some New York Times articles about, is a group of entomopathogen that affects these organisms. Does anyone want to guess what this organism is? There's a clue in the photo. If anyone guesses in the next sort of maybe 20 seconds here, Marissa can chime in and tell me if anyone guessed it.
All right, we've got, I guess, someone thinks possibly a bee, a wasp, a cicada.
Cicada is correct.
Ding, ding, ding.
Ding. So this was taken up at Big Basin. This is one of our local cicadas emerging from its into its adult form. So it's spreading out its wings. It's sort of pumping its hemolymph, which is like arthropod blood, into those veins and stiffening the wings and getting ready to fly around. But not every cicada is so lucky. This cicada happened to make it to adulthood, but especially back east where cicadas are a big phenomenon. You know, the 17-year cicadas emerge in their millions every 17 years or so, or some of the species are on different cycles where they emerge on different periodicity. Some of those cicadas, before they emerge, are infected in the soil where their larval stages were developing with a fungus called Massospora. Massospora cicadina is one of them. And this was recently discovered to flood its host with a bunch of extremely potent neurotropic chemicals like DMT and psilocybin and LSD analogs. So a bunch of extremely neurologically active compounds are going into this cicada's body. And they probably don't have the same effects that they do on humans, but it probably does have something to do with how the fungus is controlling the behavior of its host. And in the case of the cicadas, what that behavioral control ends up looking like, it has been termed the flying salt shaker of death. If that's not spooky, I don't know what is. So this is what a cicada looks like when it's overtaken by a Massospora. That is the butt of the cicada, not a technical term, but you get the picture. And it has been completely hollowed out and replaced by a mass of fungal spores. So this powdery mass of fungal spores gets shaken over the landscape as that cicada flaps around. So it's the flying salt shaker, not salt, spores of death, because that cicada eventually dies, but not before it goes through a long and strange final few days of life, where it's probably having some psychedelic experiences and trying to mate with reproductive parts it no longer even has. It's been completely co-opted by this fungus to just disperse its spores over the landscape. So these are some pretty complete takeovers of the host nervous system that these fungi are able to enact. Some more parasitic fungi. These are a very poorly understood group of fungi called the MICROSPORIDIA. They are some of the most primitive, so to speak. That means highly reduced, very small fungi. They're microscopic, as you might imagine from the name. And they do very strange things in their hosts. They're almost all on vertebrates, including things like halibut. Now, we normally don't think of fungi as being in marine environments, being in the ocean, but there are totally fungi in marine environments, down all the way to the hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean floor, as well as in the sediments, as well as in the water column, as well as at the surface. And in this case, the microsporidian fungi are causing something called a xenoma. And that's what that big tumor-like mass is emerging from the gill cover of that halibut or that flatfish. So these are actually commercially important. They affect a fish that we fish for commercially as humans. And these are really strange fungi. They cause usually not outright death in their hosts, but they cause strange sets of symptoms like sex changes. They may cause an organism to suddenly swap sex, or it can cause gigantism, where suddenly the host is much bigger than it normally would be. Like it may coincide with a sex change, or in some cases with what's called a parasitic castration, where it suddenly becomes sterile. It may be a giant one of its species, but it can no longer reproduce. It can also cause just things like general fertility loss or loss of vigor, or a shortening of the lifespan. So they don't kill the organism outright like some of these parasitic fungi, but they cause these more diffuse, slow, very strange sets of symptoms. So microsporidians are very poorly studied, very poorly known, but they occur in vertebrates, which were vertebrates. So there may be cause for concern here, especially once we start talking about what I'm going to talk about later in this talk, the emergence of new diseases. Now, if emergence of new diseases doesn't ring any bells for you in this year, 2020, you've missed a few things. And the emergence of diseases is going to continue to be something that humans need to think about in a really serious way, both in terms of fungal disease as well as in terms of viral and bacterial diseases. So we'll talk more about that later, but microsporidian fungi may be one of the groups of organisms that we need to keep a closer eye on as the world changes, as the context that these organisms live in changes. We're having impacts on the environment that are causing diseases to emerge, and this might be a group that's worth paying attention to. I think I already said this. Okay, restricted to animals. So there are no microsporidian fungi on plants or on other fungi, as far as we know. They're on animals, and at least 10% of them are on vertebrates. So this brings us closer to what I was just mentioning. So we tend to get weirded out by fungi that have odd lifestyles that sort of are strange to our human intuition. But there are fungi that we should be much more concerned about, that we tend to turn a blind eye to because they're small, or they have impacts that are unclear on human civilization, or that are sort of cumulative or long-term. And we tend not to be scared of them. We don't think of them as ghoulish in any way, but they actually might be much more relevant and much more scary from our perspective than we give them credit for. We tend to think of whether an organism is dangerous in the immediate sense. So you might be scared of the death cap mushroom, for example. It gets a lot of press for being a deadly toxic mushroom, when in fact it causes very few cases of fatal poisonings per year, and fewer every year as people become more educated. And we tend to think about whether organisms are dangerous in the immediate term. Is it dangerous now? So a death cap is not exactly something that represents that, but we tend to be scared of things like mountain lions or other organisms that we can sort of visualize what a deadly encounter with them might look like, when in fact they're extremely rare. It's extremely unlikely that you'll ever be attacked by a great white shark or by a mountain lion. But if I were to tell you something about Candida auris, it probably wouldn't ring any bells for you. But this is a fungus that actually might pose a serious threat to human civilization, and we tend to ignore these things. So we're going to talk a little bit about what those organisms might be. So the perspective I want to switch into is not so much organisms that are dangerous to individuals in the near term, but organisms that are dangerous to civilizations in the long term. So is this dangerous to us, and is this dangerous to the future? So this takes a little bit of foresight, a little bit of wondering down the road, trying to see around the corner of how the world is changing and what things are emerging that might threaten our civilization. So let's get into this. What makes this difficult is that our brains have basically two modes of reacting to threats. One is the amygdala, which is highly reactive, and that sort of takes up a lot of our time as human beings. We're really good at reactive fear. But thankfully, we have a neocortex. That's the big front part of the brain that makes us human, that makes us sort of reason, that makes us sort of rational, adult, functioning human beings. And that allows us to think about the future, to think about things that aren't yet a threat to us, but which might be worth getting out ahead of and being proactive about how we deal with them. So we're going to try and embody that neocortex part of the brain a little bit here. So some of you have heard of the white nose syndrome that affects bats, and probably fewer of you have heard of the snake fungal disease, which is causing major declines in some snake populations in the Northeast. Both of these are fairly recent phenomena. And this is sort of examples of non-human diseases that have recently emerged, sort of the way that we are experiencing COVID right now. Bats have experienced this fungal disease over the past decade or so in greater and greater severity. And what happens with the bats is that when they go into hibernation in the winter, their body temperatures drop. And body temperature, it turns out, is one of the main ways that mammals regulate or have a resistance to fungal diseases. Fungal diseases tend to be very poorly adapted for warm environments. And as a mammal, you and I have the luxury of being warm environments. We are, usually hovering around 98.6, and parts of our bodies, like our gut microbiome, is actually much hotter than that. So we tend to be difficult environments for fungi to grow on. And it's thought that actually that the mammals that exist on Earth right now were heavily selected for it sometime in the deep past by some fungal pathogens that make it so that the mammals that live on Earth now also have an immune system resistance, an innate immune system resistance that is more specifically geared towards fungi than to things like bacteria. So we may have this innate immune system resilience, as well as temperature resilience that prevents us from being good hosts for fungal diseases. But a very scary thing about climate change is that it is increasing the background level of warmth, the background temperature of ecosystems around the world, that is allowing for fungi to adapt to warmer temperatures in the habitat they naturally occur in. And it brings their natural habitat temperature closer to the human body temperature. And as that gap, which may have been quite large before, is narrowed, the switch between their natural, so to speak, environment and the human body as an environment is lower, and it's easier for them to make that jump. So this is a real concern, and I'm going to cover later an example of a fungal disease that we think may have emerged in humans in the past 10 or 20 years that was facilitated directly by climate change, by a narrowing of the gap between environmental temperature and the human body temperature. And really the pattern that's reiterated here is that fungi exist in contexts. They are ecological organisms in the same way that every other organism is embedded in an ecology. There's no way to say that an organism isn't ecological, with the possible exception of humans, because we have this direct way of manipulating things so rapidly that we can have sort of profoundly faster effects on the ecology around us, where things don't move in an evolutionary sort of slow-paced lockstep, where there's sort of a response and adaptation back and forth between webs of ecological interaction. We sort of tend to break ecologies and then let things settle in the dust, which might include extinction, but it might also include these things like emerging diseases in this sort of sudden way. mass changes all at once. So fungi are in these tightly co-evolved webs of interactions with other organisms that humans and the activities of humans disrupt. And when we disrupt those webs, we get unpredictable consequences, some of which are extinctions, some of which are, in this case, diseases. So let's talk about one of those. Cladophyalophora bantiana. The name is enough to be spooky. That should scare you, just because it's so difficult to pronounce. But what this fungus is a neurological disease. So that horrendous looking photo on the left shows a hole in that person's brain. And what that really is a lesion and a gall caused by this fungus, Cladophyalophora. And on the right, you can see those sort of terrible looking things in figure A are the actual masses caused by the fungus growing in someone's brain. So it causes neurodegenerative symptoms, and it's about 60% fatal, which is an extraordinarily high fatality rate. Compare that to COVID's, single digits percentage. This is a very deadly disease. Thankfully, it's still extremely rare. It's only known from humans, though. We don't really know where it lives in natural environments, so to speak. What we think might be the case is that it is an extremely rare soil pathogen, or a soil fungus that comes into contact with people when they're doing strange things like mining or excavating in very dry environments in mine shafts, or disturbing a lot of soil or bedrock in a way that isn't very natural. And when people come into contact with this fungus, it colonizes their bodies. It belongs to a group of fungi called the Chaetotheriales, which are the black yeasts, and they almost all seem to show this pattern, where they're very rare in their native environment, whatever that is, but they are able to colonize human bodies and cause really serious negative symptoms. Some of the other places that we know black yeasts occur are in these strange environments like steam baths, geothermal areas, toxic waste. So they've been isolated from, for example, creosoted oak wood, oil polluted soil, industrial exhaust, and garages. These are all very heavily human modified environments that seem to select for this particularly pathogenic group of fungi. So by our activities, we modify what the native ecology is, and we select for a group of organisms that tend to be very problematic for humans. So it's sort of a bad luck outcome. I don't know exactly why they have the ability to jump from these normally rare ecologies into human bodies so easily, but that's what we've got, and it's likely to continue to be a problem as human activities continue to disturb these sort of strange environments or create these strange environments. So now we get to Candida auris. This is a yeast. So it's an ascomycete fungus, and this is the disease that is thought to be directly facilitated by climate change. So its emergence happened all at once. It appeared on 3 different continents, all at about the same time in about 2012, 2015, or actually I think a little bit earlier. And it is extremely multiple drug resistant. So it's very hard to treat. It mostly is in immune compromised individuals at the moment. So it's less of a concern than, I don't know, say something like COVID, which can affect more or less anybody. This still appears to be a disease that is acquired mostly in hospitals amongst people who have some sort of pre-existing immune compromised syndrome. But what's scary about Candida auris is that if you do get it, there's not a good way to treat it. It's resistant to antifungals that we have. It's resistant to most treatments that we have, and it does have a fairly high fatality rate. So how is it that this fungus suddenly emerged on 3 continents at once, all with multiple drug resistance? Well, a paper came out in 2019 that has some hypotheses about this. And the first hypothesis that they have is that a warming climate brought things like wetlands, like swamps, higher in their sort of background temperature range, that allowed a few fungi that normally live there to adapt to that higher temperature range and made the jump to a human temperature easier. But that doesn't by itself explain how it suddenly emerged in such widely disparate areas. One of the ways that they think it may have moved around is through birds. Now, this is sort of how H1N1 moved around some of the early SARS epidemics. And this is no surprise, right? We all know that birds are horrible. That's not really true. Obviously, this bird is very beautiful, but if you need proof that birds are horrible, here's something called the lesser adjutant, horrendous looking bird. But these are both natural birds doing natural nice things. The real trouble bird here is this horror show that we call the chicken. These industrial sort of monstrosities that live in very close proximity to dense human populations around the world. People interact with them in very close proximity where we touch their bodies. When we slaughter them, we're often in contact with their blood or their feces. So these dense populations, abnormally dense populations of domesticated animals that can pick up the occasional pathogen from wild populations of birds, perhaps it lived in that wetland where the Canada originally lived and suddenly was brought into that higher temperature range. And since birds fly, at least things that aren't chickens, there's sort of a natural progression from wetlands to native birds to domestic birds and then to humans. But why are they drug resistant? Why are they multiple drug resistant? Swamps. This is sort of a natural place to expect diseases to come from. This is not too surprising. But azoles are the reason that we think that this fungus might be so resistant to our normal antifungal drugs. Now, what are azoles? They're an antifungal drug that we use really heavily in agriculture. They have this sort of generalized chemical structure. And the overuse of these antimicrobial compounds is a common way for naturally occurring organisms to become drug resistant, is when we sort of want to take a scorched earth approach to agriculture or strongly select against native microorganisms as a means of making life easier for intensive production of something that we find commercially valuable. So there's negative consequences to messing with ecologies in these very intensive, unnatural, human-driven ways. So the combination of wetlands getting warmer, domestic populations dense populations of domestic birds in close contact with human populations, and then the emergence sort of potentially facilitated by long-distance dispersal by native birds is how they are hypothesizing that Candida auris emerged all of a sudden into the human scene. And it's now present across the globe. It's on at least 33 countries where it's caused deaths, I think, in all of them. So it's something to keep an eye on. If it ever jumps out of the hospital setting, out of immune-compromised individuals into sort of the more general human population, it's something that could be seriously problematic because we have no way of treating it, really. All right, for a little palate cleanser, here's chicken of the woods. You've probably seen this mushroom. It's a delicious edible, even including that little sprig of candy corn that I photoshopped in. How many of you noticed it? I know some people noticed it real quick. I'm looking at you, Caleb. Yeah. Anyways, this is a really good mushroom to eat. It's fruiting right now across a lot of Central California. I just want to use this as a segue back to fun, lighthearted Halloween topics because I know multiple drug-resistant, highly pathogenic fungi is not what anyone wants to talk about in this year. So we're going to get into some more lighthearted stuff now. But if you find this mushroom, make sure to cook it really thoroughly. A quick parboil will usually make it more digestible. It's delicious. I really like it, but it has some stomach irritating compounds that are usually done away with if you cook it really thoroughly. I've eaten it 5 times. 4 of them went really well and they were delicious. And one of them I didn't cook it very thoroughly because I was backpacking and cooked it on a little camp stove. And I felt rather unwell for about 10 hours. All right, we're going to talk about Dracula because what could be more Halloween oriented than Dracula? Now, I don't mean Nosferatu and I don't mean Viago. I'm talking about Dracula orchids. Now, orchids are not fungi. What am I talking about here? Why am I introducing orchids into a talk about fungi? These are Dracula orchids. They grow in the tropics, especially the neotropics, I think. And there's a specialized piece on all orchids called the labellum, which is basically a landing pad for pollinators. It's what attracts pollinators to come fertilize their seeds, or their developing seeds. And Dracula orchids have a specialized labellum that's modified to look like a mushroom. So in the upper left there, it looks fairly fungal. It's got these gills, these radiating blades, and a little cap. And what's more amazing, or especially amazing, is that the habitats that these Dracula orchids grow in, they coexist with fungi that look really, really similar to their labellums. And they even produce a small or a compound made of a long chain alcohol that smells just like these mushrooms. So they're producing visual and olfactory cues that make, in this case, the pollinator is a fungus gnat that's trying to lay its eggs in a mushroom, but instead it gets tricked and fooled into visiting the labellum of these Dracula orchids. It's the genus of orchids. I don't know why it's called Dracula. Don't ask me. It's Halloween. We're going to take it and run with it. So these habitats have both these little fungi as well as these Dracula orchids coexisting side by side, tricking the pollinators into visiting them and trying to lay their eggs in them and instead pollinating the orchid. That's pretty cool. But I think my favorite of all the ghoulish stories of fungi is this really cool looking fungus in its own right. Those mushrooms are really pretty. They've got purple stems and these sort of rugose, wrinkled caps. And they're growing in a dense little troop, very attractive. This is in New Zealand. I found these last May, I believe. But in and of themselves, they don't look ghoulish. So what's going on with these? Well, I'll show you another picture showing these mushrooms in their habitat, and maybe you'll understand why I've included them. So there they are in the middle, and what's over on the right? A skull. What is that skull of? It's a brushy-tailed possum, which is a marsupial that is not native to New Zealand. And what happens is, in the state parks, in the national parks rather, these brushy-tailed possums are trapped and killed as a way of keeping native songbirds safe from their predatory egg-eating habits. And they sort of let them decompose in the forest after they kill them. And as you can see in this picture, their body, as it decomposes, selects for these Lacaria, is the name of these mushrooms, and it grows in the area where their body releases ammonia and urea and all these nitrogen-rich compounds. So these mushrooms are adapted to growing in these nitrogen-enriched soils where carcasses of dead animals are decaying. This picture made the rounds on the internet recently. My co-author Noah Siegel and I were together taking pictures of this amazing fruiting of Lacaria, and he decided to pick a little cluster of them and put them in the mummified paw of this dead brushy-tailed possum. Now, a lot of people got confused and thought that these fungi were growing there naturally. If you do encounter this photo making its viral rounds online, which it totally did last year, don't be fooled. Correct people. They're not growing out of the hand of that possum. It was staged. Fake news. Please debunk it. It's a cool picture, but they weren't growing there naturally. It was staged. Our fault. So this is what they look like growing out of sort of another bit of that brushy-tailed possum carcass. It's a truly amazing mushroom, and it's not the only one in the world that does this. There's another one called Hebeloma syriense that grows in California, at least in the Pacific Northwest, I think, as well as in far northern California, out of the carcasses of decaying deer. And there's one in Australia called Hebeloma ammonophyllum that was found mostly in two different kinds of places. One around the decaying carcasses of wallabies, and also behind trees near trails. Now, what connects those two habitats? Well, trees near trails tend to be places where people go enrich the soil with urea, shall we say, and that mimics a decaying wallaby carcass because suddenly the nitrogen content of the soil goes up really suddenly, and this fungus fruits all around it. So places where people go take a leak behind a tree, as well as a decaying possum carcass or a wallaby carcass, can all be a very similar habitat from a fungal perspective. These fungi are actually useful, have been used in the study of taphonomy, which is the study of graves and the decay of organisms where they die. This is sometimes used in like CSI type situations where they're trying to determine, they being detectives or sort of investigators of a potential crime scene, are trying to determine the date at which a carcass was sort of died in place and how long it's been there. You can sort of track the progression of fungi over that time. There's an ecological succession of different species that can help you determine how long a fungus or a carcass has been in the place where it's rotting in the woods. Unfortunately, this occasionally is useful for human remains, but we're going to focus strictly on these slightly less disturbing, but still somewhat ghoulish mammals. And last, to close this out with just a little bit more lighthearted Halloween-themed fungus. This is one that you're likely to see in the redwood forests around Santa Cruz. This is called Hygrocebi singeri, and the common name is witch's hat. It comes in these very Halloween-themed colors of yellow, orange, red, and as they age, they turn completely black, which is totally natural. They're not rotting or anything. They just turn black in a couple days. A friend of mine, I think, had one of the most amazing Halloween encounters with this fungus. He found a big group of them growing under cedars in, I think, Seattle, in a graveyard on Halloween. So it doesn't get more Halloween themed than that. If you have such an experience, you're lucky. I envy you. And with that, I'm going to end this ghoulish Halloween themed fungal lecture and take questions from Marisa.
Awesome. Thank you, Christian. We did have a few questions, particularly someone's wondering if we can go back.
Yeah, totally.
Early on, when you were talking about, I believe it was Massospora.
Yeah.
And so could you just like explain how it's possible that the cicada can still fly and move around?
Okay, I cannot explain to you how the cicada can still move and fly around because that is wacky. It's bananas. It's weird. It doesn't make much sense. This wouldn't make sense from a human perspective. But what's going on here is that all that white powder you see in the photo here is spores. Those spores are shaken out by the cicada over the landscape as it flies around. They land in the soil. They infect a larval cicada that's in the soil. And that spore germinates into the cicada's body and starts producing compounds like DMT, like psilocybin, like LSD, that are very neurologically active. And they rot the body of the cicada from the inside, consume it. This fungus rots the body and turns it into more spores and keeps it alive long enough by pumping it full of these neurotropic sort of, let's say, performance-enhancing drugs. And keeps that cicada flying much longer than it would. It's like Red Bull for cicadas, except a lot more gruesome. I don't know how long the cicada survives. It's probably not terribly long, probably not as long as a normal adult cicada uninfected by fungus. But during that time that it's being sort of neurologically messed with, it is slowly dying and it's sprinkling the spores of that fungus all over the landscape. So it's this gruesome loop of spore to soil to cicada to air to flying salt shaker of death.
Okay.
I don't know how it preserves the cicada long enough to do this. It doesn't make sense to me.
Is this something that, are there accounts of humans like ingesting the spores of this? It sounds like it has psychedelic properties, so I just wouldn't put it past people.
I'm so glad you asked. I have a friend who's a biochemist who knew that as soon as this paper came out, someone would ask that question because humans, if there's a way to get high, will find it. And if it involves eating tons of powdery cicadas and making ourselves sick, we'll try it at least once. The answer is you would have to eat about 1,000 of these cicadas to approximate the dose of psilocybin or analogous psychedelic compound to feel an effect. So you're extremely unlikely to find 1,000 of these infected cicadas at once, and you're even less likely to eat all of them, I hope. The answer is this is not a good way to get high. It's cheaper to do other ways.
Okay. We also have a question that is, I believe a joke, but I'm going to roll with it. To what degree am I currently controlled by fungi? I'm wondering if you can take that and spin it into like, how much do fungi, are our daily lives impacted by fungi, maybe in ways that we don't think about?
Did you eat bread today?
I did, personally.
Drink a beer an hour ago?
Not yet.
Will you drink a beer an hour from now? Have you ever had a penicillin shot? Are your genes acid washed? Is your cheese fermented? All of those are fungal activities. They are deeply entwined with human culture and civilization from way back in the past. I mean, time immemorial. Fungi are in all of our foods. They're in our body right now. Your microbiome, your gut is full of fungi. And we know increasingly that moods, cognitive abilities are affected by our gut microbiome. Serotonin production is very directly linked to your gut microbiome. Serotonin is a human neurotransmitter. So your mind is very much influenced by the fungi that are living in and on your body. It's not really a joke. It's not ingest. This is a very increasingly direct link that we're becoming more and more aware of. So there are many ways that humans interact with fungi every day, both seen and unseen. And some of the most important ones, like your microbiome, are only becoming clear to us in the past 5 or 10 years. I think the bulk of what we're going to learn about how fungi control our moods, or let's not say control, influence our moods, our brain chemistry. The bulk of what we learn about that is still to come. We're just sort of the tip of the iceberg right now.
Yeah. Another question that came in about like these macabre specimens too, that maybe didn't come up in your talk. Someone's curious about the mushroom that appears to bleed red goo.
Okay, hold up 1 second. I'm gonna pull this up. All right.
There's like so many to choose from.
Can you see this?
No, you're still sharing the PowerPoint, I think, specifically. So.
Can you see that?
Yes. Yes.
That's Hydnellum pecii. That grows in Santa Cruz County, and it's bleeding red, obviously. Very ghoulish, very macabre. What's going on there? Anyone have a guess? Type it in real quick. I'm going to answer it in the next 5 seconds here. That mushroom is peeing, basically. That's metabolic exudate. That's just waste products. That mushroom is actively growing. And just like you and I, when we actively grow, we sort of have breakdown compounds from eating food, stuff we didn't totally digest. And those sort of metabolic waste products have to go somewhere. And in this case, it gets sort of infused with this dye compound. I think they're called I forget the name of the compounds, but they're actually very good dye compounds. They dye proteinaceous wool and silk fabrics really strongly. But basically that's just sweat or pee. That's the way to think about mushroom exudation. This is not an edible mushroom, even though the common name is strawberries and cream. It is a burning hot, peppery, extremely acrid tasting mushroom. It is not good to eat. I don't recommend it.
Apparently it's good for dyeing though.
Yeah, those are those dye pigments I was mentioning.
Yeah.
You can get some blue-green compounds that dye wool, these amazing blue-green colors out of mushrooms like Hydnellum.
Yeah, surprising uses. Another sort of question, comment, and jest that came in was someone pointed out that they recently watched the mushroom episode of the X-Files. And so that's pretty much all that it was. And so I'm going to reframe this and try to make it into a question for you. It's a two-parter. A, do you know what that means, the mushroom episode from the X-Files? And B, what do you think about the portrayal of mushrooms in the media?
Okay, so the short answer to that is that I've heard of the X-Files mushroom episode a lot, and I regret to say that I have not yet watched the mushroom X-Files episode. I'm sorry, I can't really answer that. I think it has something to do with a cordyceps-like scenario where spores are infecting humans and controlling their bodies and maybe leaving hollowed out husks of humans across the landscape.
That sounds very right.
It sounds like a very X-Files thing to do. There's also like a super campy, I think it's a Japanese film called Matango, Attack of the Killer Mushroom, that you should also look up if that floats your boat. Portrayal of mushrooms in the media. I don't want to have a big chip on my shoulder, but I will say that for the longest time, they didn't get a fair shake. They're often sort of portrayed in very simplistic terms as harbingers of death and decay. But I will say that since I've started studying them in the past 10 or 20 years, they are getting seemingly lots and lots more interest every year. I think we're coming around to fully understanding and appreciating fungi for the roles that they play in the ecosystem and in our human environments as well. Wait, hold on. Merlin Sheldrake, who wrote Entangled Life, it's this new book about fungi that is blowing minds all over the place, apparently. David Byrne of Talking Heads fame was just interviewed on Rolling Stone saying he is finally appreciating just how wonderful fungi are. And I feel like if that doesn't mean we've made it, I think we've made it. I think we're here. We've arrived at peak mushroom.
Yeah, peak pop culture fame with David Byrne. I love it.
For me, anyways.
Yeah. So speaking of like giving our attention to mushrooms and mushrooms being in the now, maybe we can switch gears and go back to something you mentioned early on about what you're doing right now. You're looking at fire impacted areas, and it sounds like you're doing that at a more general ecological manner, but I'm curious if you have any plans for looking into fungal responses to fire, like what our community's been experiencing after the CZU lightning complex here in Santa Cruz.
Yeah, so to begin with, it may be somewhat unintuitive for people to think of fungi, who think of fungi as organisms that live in damp, dark, humid, rich soil. But there's a whole suite of fungal diversity that we call the fire-following fungi. So these are fungi that immediately colonize the soil right after a forest fire and can account for almost all of the biodiversity, almost all of the genetic material in the soil after a fire is fungal, in some places anyways. Things like morels, which are a delicious edible mushroom, are also famous for being fire-following fungi. And they play an important role in breaking down the sudden influx of dead wood after a forest fire. So they are definitely, there's a whole suite of fungi that have interactions with fire as an ecological force. Plans for studying fungi after fire in Santa Cruz, in the CZU fire area. I have some long-term transects that I've been monitoring for 2 years, and I'm going into my 3rd year of monitoring this year. Of those 10 transects, 4 of them were burned over the summer, including 3 of them at Big Basin, which were completely incinerated, basically. So I don't know what to expect. It's not a habitat that there's a lot of data about, but we're certainly going to learn something about what happens to a coast redwood forest after it burns in terms of the fungal response. And I look forward to being able to share that with you in the spring. But I don't know yet. I don't know what to expect. There was already fungi fruiting in Big Basin amidst smoldering charcoal when I was there a week and a half ago. The dead redwood logs that had fallen already had polypore mushrooms growing out of the sides of them. So fungi are extremely rapid to respond, even in the wake of something as intense as the CZU fire.
Okay. Well, looking forward to hearing more about what you find. And I guess maybe we can do a few rapid fire, like highly specific questions for you. Let me see. If I see a mushroom at the base of a tree, does that mean it's been used a lot, or is that specific to the species mentioned at the end? Does that make sense to you?
Oh, in our area, we do not have those nitrogen specialists that are going to be fruiting behind your favorite pea tree. That said, if you have a tree that you personally visit routinely and you see a fungus fruiting following your ecological influence, who knows? I don't know, report it to me. Could be interesting. Okay. Probably not, though.
Yeah, that one went over my head at first, but I get it now.
Yeah, it took me. I had to like ponder that one.
So thank you, Maggie.
I appreciate the genteel tact wording of that. Yes. Not too on the nose.
Tactful. All right, another one. Last year I came across a big patch of fungus growing under a mulberry tree, and after a few days, hundreds of flies and their maggots were eating the fungus. Any idea what it is?
So there's a whole group of gnats called mycetophilid, which just means fungus friend or fungus loving gnats. And they sort of specialize in laying their eggs in the fruit bodies of different fungi and having their larvae tunnel out through the fungus and using that as their source of nutrition as they mature into adults. So probably what happened is a whole swarm of mycetophilid gnats found that mushroom, and you saw the result, the end result.
Okay. Another one. How many species of psilocybin grow in the Central Coast?
I would say, okay, so almost none natively, basically.
Oh.
These things move around with people, or should I say people move these things around with them. Folks move these around on wood chips. That's one of the commonest ways for psilocybin mushrooms to move around California. There's probably 2 native species in California. Semilanceata up in the elk dung fertilized meadows of the Pacific Northwest, up in Humboldt and Del Norte counties, and probably Psilocybe cyanescens in the dunes of the Northwest. And those probably moved around and jumped to wood chip habitats and human modified habitats over time. But there's not too many in California.
Okay. Another one, a question came through related to the fungus colonizing after death and destruction, i.e. fire. If you've listened to the Radiolab Fungus Among Us, what's your take on mushrooms ruling the planet after the asteroids struck the planet, decomposing all of the dead life forms? Is this widely accepted among the scientific community?
I'm not super well versed on paleomycology. However, I will say that for a while there was a theory that the reason we have such large fossil fuel deposits, which are basically old sources of carbon that didn't decompose in the way that we would expect them to nowadays if they had been deposited in modern times. One of the theories was that because there was no fungal decay of that carbon source accumulated, and that's why we had fossil fuels to exploit as humans nowadays. That theory apparently has fallen out of favor. It has since been disproven. I think the hypothesis is no longer accepted that the absence of fungal enzymes allowed for carbon to accumulate into fossil fuels. So I don't know if that's what the writer is referring to here, but if you do hear about that hypothesis, it doesn't seem to be in favor anymore.
Okay. All right, another question just came through. What are your feelings on homegrown mushroom kits?
I think they're delightful, and you should try it.
Yeah, have you tried it?
I have, and sometimes it's really successful and sometimes it's not. But when it's successful, it feels like you just have the weirdest little pet, which, yeah, it floats my boat.
Yeah, I agree. I dig it. And I guess I'll maybe close us out with a final question. So let's think about like Santa Cruz County general area. I think most people are probably here, although I know people are joining us from afar. But can you maybe tell us like one species that you think we should be on the lookout for on our hikes over the next like week or two?
Over the next week or two? Well, that one that I showed you, the chicken of the woods with the candy corn, that is sort of, it's an early season mushroom. It fruits before the rain starts, and it's really big. You know, it can be a meter across. It's really spectacular. It's bright orange and yellow, and it grows around people. It loves eucalyptus trees. It loves urban trees. If you go to the post office in Santa Cruz, park your bike at the bike rack and look up in that carob tree. There is one fruiting right now.
Very specific directions.
Yeah.
That's great.
It is just a really charismatic fungus that's all over the state, from the furthest northern corner all the way to San Diego. It's easy to see, and it's growing now even before the rains arrive. So keep your eye out for that one.
Okay. All right. And then maybe like after the very first rain.
Okay. Once it's raining, you want a rainy season mushroom to look out for.
Let's do that too.
Okay. Well, it depends on where you are in California, but you can see my screen, right? I'm gonna.
No, not yet. I stopped sharing it.
Okay. Good call. 1 second here. All right, can you see this one?
That's the same one that you showed before.
How about that one?
Yeah.
All right, this is the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, and this is definitely a Halloween mushroom. It's called a jack-o'-lantern, for goodness sake. The reason it's called jack-o'-lantern is that it's orange like a pumpkin, and it glows in the dark. It's bioluminescent. It has luciferin in it, luciferin and luciferase, two compounds that interact to produce a blue-green light that comes out of the gills. It grows from northern Baja California all the way to the state line to Oregon. So anywhere in California, you can expect to find this mushroom growing on dead and decaying oak trees. And if you take a fruit body that's fresh into a very dark closet and sit and have a little special time with it and let your eyes adjust in total darkness, you will see the gills start to glow blue-green as your eyes adjust to the darkness. It's just one of the coolest mushrooms in the world. Don't eat it, it's toxic. So it's a little spooky in that regard, but I think it might be one of my favorite mushrooms.
Awesome. So everyone be on the lookout for that once the rains.
Oh, one important note there. David Aurora suggests that your chances of success are higher if you have a cheese sandwich with you.
Okay.
Just to eat.
Does it matter what kind of cheese?
I think it has to be Fontina.
Fontina cheese sandwich. All right.
For Gruyere.
Good to know. All right, fine. One final question. Are you dressing up for Halloween? And if so, what are you dressing up as? And if not, what do you wish you were dressing up as?
What do I wish I was dressing? So one Halloween, I don't know what I'm dressing up as this year because I'm just so bummed out on everything. Because I don't know who will even witness my costume. And what's the point? I don't know. One year I dressed up as a stinkhorn though. And I had a spore case on my head, and I had a veil that descended down over my face, and I had like a little fly that crawled up towards the spore mass. And I think that was the only fungal costume I've ever done, but I do think it's probably the best one I ever will do. So maybe I'll break out the stinkhorn costume again.
Nice. Okay. And yeah, for everyone joining us, we encourage you to consider how you might do a fungally themed Halloween costume, and hope that you do enjoy your Halloween on Saturday. And thanks for joining us. I also just wanted to maybe take a moment to say that, you know, Christian, you take great pictures. Love your nature photography always. The museum is going to be announcing an upcoming community sourced photography exhibit shortly in the coming days. And so if any of you joining us today have been taking pictures of the nature of Santa Cruz County this past year, maybe be on the lookout. I will put in the chat a way for you to sign up for our newsletter so you get notified about more events like tonight's event and also upcoming exhibits. And also, so you can go there. I will also share a link really quickly. If you are in need of a copy of Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, and if you do not have one, you are in need of it, you may purchase one through the museum store. There's another link for you there. And final link I'm going to share with you, which I will also be sharing in an email, a follow-up email, is a survey. So let us know how this went for you and other topics you may be interested in hearing about from the museum. We hope to have you join us in the future. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And Christian, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Marisa.
Have fun out in the fields.
Adios.
All right.